Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new. My name is Miriam, and today I'll be going over all the books I read in February. So I read roughly around the same amount of books in February that I read in January, which I'm totally fine with. I think 9 books in a busy month is great, and so I'm really happy with what I read. It was another month of like mixed ratings, so I didn't absolutely love all the books I read, but there are definitely a few that really stood out to me, and I'm excited to talk about them. So I usually like to start off with the books that I DNF'd, and then my lowest rated book, working my way up to my favorite book of the month. So I actually DNF'd 3 books this month, which I'm kind of glad that I did because I don't easily DNF a book. I tend to push through, I guess, more out of guilt than anything, but I just couldn't get into these books and I had to put them down. So the first one that I put down is Russian Winter by Daphne Calitae. And this book is about a woman who was a ballerina in Russia in the earlier 20th century, and then she ended up moving to America, and there's a mystery behind a bunch of jewels that she ended up selling. And I just didn't find the writing style to be very engaging. I found it to be quite difficult to get into, to attach to the characters. So I ended up just putting the book down. I also DNF'd Hostage, which is a thriller, and it's about a woman who is a flight attendant, and she ends up on a plane, and the plane is basically threatened. So someone is kind of like keeping all the passengers hostage, and the writing style was quite dry. I didn't really connect to the characters, and I really do struggle with thrillers. If I don't find the characters to be interesting, or if I'm not jiving with the writing style, I tend to easily not enjoy thrillers. So I also did not finish this book. And then I also tried reading The Railway Children, which is a children's classic, middle grade type of book. And I only got a few chapters in before I put it down. I was just bored. I couldn't get into the story. I find this to be the case with certain children's classics. I either love them or I just can't get into them. So those are the 3 books I DNF'd. And now I'll start talking about the books that I did finish this month. So my least favorite book of the month is actually the second in a duology, and I read both books this month. So I'll talk about the first book first, and then I'll talk about the second one. So I read A Curse So Dark and Lonely, and I gave this one a 3 stars. I overall enjoyed it. It's a very well-known young adult fantasy about a girl named Harper who ends up being brought to this alternate universe, alternate reality. She's from DC, and she ends up in this magical world where there is a young man who happens to turn into a beast. Something happened in the past, he was cursed by a sorceress, the typical Beauty and the Beast, but with its own flair to it. I really did like Harper as a character, but at the same time, I found that the characters just felt too familiar, and as I read more YA fantasy, I'm finding that they're very similar in the way they talk, the way they act, and I don't know, I wasn't really that interested in the story, and I did want to continue on with the trilogy though, because one of the side characters named Gray, he interested me a little bit more. So I wanted to see how his story would continue into the second book, and that's why I ended up reading it. But I really did not like it. I gave it 2 stars, unfortunately. It just did not do it for me, and I ended up unhauling both of these books. Although I am open to trying more of Brigid Kemmerer's works, and especially her newest, Defy the Night. I do really want to read that. Let me know if it's similar in feel and characterization to this trilogy. I'd really like to know if you guys have read it. So those were unfortunately my least favorite books this month. Next we have the complete Grimm's Fairy Tales. I feel like at this point everyone has at least heard about the Grimm's Fairy Tales. A lot of Disney movies are based off of them. But I did not enjoy these fairy tales as much as I thought I would. I rated this entire collection a 3 out of 5, and there were certain fairy tales that I actually really did enjoy, but again, they were more like the typical ones, the more well-known ones, like Cinderella, Rapunzel, Hansel and Gretel. My favorite was The Goose Girl, so that's probably going to remain my favorite Grimm's fairy tale, and I don't really know what else to say other than reading this entire book. It took me a few months, so I did start back in, I think, December, and finally finished it in February. And although I didn't enjoy every fairy tale, I still think this is a very special collection. But again, the fairy tales are just not very engaging, and they're also a product of their time, but it's a very, very sweet collection, and I don't regret reading it. So that is the complete Grimm's Fairy Tales. Another book I gave 3 stars to is She Kills Me, and this is a true crime, very short book that I borrowed from the library, and it's basically a collection of very short chapters, and each chapter is about a different woman in history who was a killer of some sort. I did really enjoy how each person's story, each killer's story was very short, so we just got like a snapshot of what they did, what their crime was, and the author's writing style was quite entertaining. She has a lot of sarcasm, strewn throughout the chapters. One thing I didn't quite like was it seemed at times that the author was excusing the crimes. And while there are certain factors that may lead people to commit murder, to do the different things they do, I feel that the author maybe could have been more tasteful in the way she expressed her, not agreement with the crimes, but just, I guess, her sympathy towards the murderers. Not all women kill because they're driven to do it by evil men. Like, it's not always the case. There are just many women in the world who have committed awful things, done awful things, and it's because they're awful people, and it's just what it is. So I would have preferred if it were more factual rather than the author constantly giving her opinion on each woman. But overall, I did enjoy it. I enjoyed the style of the book, the way it was very, short chapters and is very quick, very easy to read. And for any true crime fan who just wants a really quick read, I think this is great. So yeah, that is She Kills Me. Next up, we have Evelyna by Frances Burney, and I gave this book a 3.75 stars. And the author Frances Burney actually inspired Jane Austen in her own writing. So Jane Austen was a fan, and I can see the similarities in the content of their books, the writing style to an extent, and being a fan of Jane Austen, I did overall enjoy this book. So this book's protagonist, her name is Evelyna, and she's basically an orphan in a sense because her mom died and her biological father refuses to acknowledge her existence. So she's basically raised by a man named Mr. Villers, and he was like a family friend, both to her grandparents and her mom. And he takes her in, he raises her as his own daughter, and he's very affectionate towards her. He shelters her. She doesn't really get out, into society until she's 17, 18. And so she goes to visit a family, and she kind of gets introduced into the London scene and balls and all that's involved in that. So very Jane Austen-esque in terms of all the happenings and all the men that are, trying to get her attention and gain her affection and things like that. One thing I really enjoyed about this book is it's written in the form of letters. So it's an epistolary novel, and every single chapter is a letter. So it's letter 18, letter 19, etc. And it's letters from Evelyna to Mr. Villers, from Mr. Villers to the woman who basically took Evelyna in her time in London. And it's just kind of a back and forth, them explaining what's been going on. A lot of Evelyna's letters are very detail heavy of what she's been doing in London, all the fun she's been having, all the, mishaps that have been occurring. And it's actually a lot funnier than I was expecting it to be, so I definitely enjoyed the humor in this book. Evelyna, being basically orphaned in a sense, is such a sweet person, and she's very naive because she's been so sheltered, and so she doesn't really know how to react to the men that are, I guess, hitting on her. She also has a grandma, so her mother's mom, who lives in France and is quite an annoying woman and tries to get Evelyna to move to France with her. And there are so many scenes where her grandma gets teased and she's the subject of many pranks, and that's one of the best parts of this book is the pranks that are pulled on her, and it's really entertaining. I really like Evelyna's sense of humor, and even though she is naive and not as knowledgeable about how the world works, she's very sweet, she's very kind, and I really enjoyed reading each letter that she wrote. And I also really love that this book has a trope, and I wouldn't say this is a spoiler, but if you don't want to know this specific trope because it may kind of hint at something that happens in the book, just skip ahead a little, but there's a really big aspect of found family to this book, and Evelyna in particular, what she has to go through to experience, I guess, reconciliation in a sense. It's so satisfying to watch, and I really enjoyed this book. So I didn't give it a higher rating than 3.75 just because there were parts that lagged, and I think the way that it's written, because it's in letter form, it can tend to do that. And it's just Evelyna saying, and then I did this, and then I did that, and then I did this, and then there's a little Mr. Villers letter saying, oh darling, why did you do that, or you shouldn't have said that, or I'm so proud of you that you did that. And it's very long-winded at times, but I really enjoyed it, and I can't wait to read more Frances Burney. I ended up finding her 3 other main novels at a thrift store. I'm so excited to read them. So that is Evelyna. This next book is a reread. I read it for the first time last year and enjoyed it quite a bit, so I decided to pick it up again, and that is The Hobbit by Jrr Tolkien. So even though I read it last year, I did forget quite a bit of what occurred in the book, and I do want to read the Lord of the Rings full trilogy this year sometime. if I can get to it. But I know you don't necessarily have to read it before, but I prefer just having, you know, the knowledge of the setting and some of the main characters before I start The Lord of the Rings. So it's a very well-known story. We have Bilbo Baggins, who is a hobbit, and he's basically tugged into a quest with these dwarves and a wizard named Gandalf, and they go on all these adventures with the ultimate goal being raiding this treasure trove, which is in a mountain, which is guarded by a large dragon named Smaug, and it's a lot of fun. It's really, really cute. It's not generally the type of story that I like to read, but I do enjoy the camaraderie between the characters and the dialogue and things like that. And so I would recommend this book. It's really sweet and a lot of fun to read. Next, we have Winter Solstice by Rosamund Pilcher. So I started this book back in December, and it is very long. The font is extremely small, so it took me quite a bit to get through it. It's around 500 pages. I don't mind that it took me so long to read it just because it is quite a slow-paced book. So this book is basically about a woman named Elfrida, and she has retired and moved to a new village, and she meets a man named Oscar who experiences a really, really big and significant tragedy in his life. And so as a result, they both end up moving to Scotland to stay in a house that he kind of like co-owns. It's a really rundown old Victorian house, and there are multiple other characters who also have their own separate points of view in this book. And they somehow end up in Scotland at this house, and their stories kind of converge, and we learn about each of them, each of their own pasts, their own heartaches and trauma, whatever it may be, the different things they have gone through in their past. It's beautiful to see how their stories collide in a really, really natural way. It doesn't feel like a convenient thing that, you know, all of them end up at this one house, and they all kind of like help each other to process what they've experienced, what they've gone through. Elfrida was definitely my favorite character, but I have to say that my heart belongs to Lucy. She's a 14-year-old girl who doesn't really experience love and affection from her mom or her grandma, and she's kind of left to her own devices. It's really sad to see, and her aunt Carrie takes her under her wing in a sense, and they end up in Scotland, and there's another man who ends up in Scotland with them. They're all just nursing their wounds together, and it's a really sweet, poignant story. My main gripe with it is that winter solstice, the actual day, doesn't occur until like the last few chapters, so it's this constant build up until winter solstice and then Christmas. And I kind of hoped it would happen a little sooner just because this book is so long and it just kind of dragged until then. I think Rosamund Pilcher is a master storyteller, and she is very, very good at dialogue, to the point that I feel like I was sitting there with the characters. It was visceral. It was an amazing experience. I think this book handled grief very well, the various stages and how people cope, and it was beautifully written. If you're in the mood for like a slower paced, kind of heartwarming story, I would recommend this. And it's ironic that I'm not a contemporary person. I'm not the biggest fan of stories that are just about people who have gone through things and just hang out and, you know, work on themselves. But she did a great job writing this book, and 4 stars means I really, really liked it. So yes, I would recommend this to all of you guys. So my second favorite book of February is Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Sulin. I was really excited for this book to come out, and the minute I saw it at my bookstore, I grabbed it off the shelves and I started reading it the same day. And I really, really enjoyed this book. I think for a debut, it is really, really good, even though it was a little tropey at times. I think the setting was really good. The characters were fun to follow. So the book starts off with a girl named Xingyin who lives on the moon. Before I continue, I think I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the other characters' names correctly. I'll do my best. But we have Xingyin, and she's 16 years old. She's living on the moon with her mom, and her mom is the moon goddess, so people in the mortal world worship her as a moon goddess. The reason she lives on the moon is because her mom drank an elixir called the Elixir of Immortality and ended up being exiled to the moon. I'm not going to go more into why she drank the elixir. I think it's good to go into the story without knowing too much of what the plot is. But before I continue talking about the plot, I just want to talk a bit about the world itself, because I was quite confused at the beginning, but I reread certain parts, and I think what the author was trying to do, and this is one thing that I kind of didn't like, was that it was a little confusing. Like I didn't really understand what the author was trying to convey in terms of her world building, just because there's a map. And so this map makes the world look like your typical, like flat, you know, just a flat world. But there are realms. So we have the moon, which is where Xingyin and her mom live. And then we have the immortal realm, which is underneath. So I think it's kind of like the world is kind of like in layers. And then beneath the immortal realm, we have the mortal realm. So Xingyin, her mom was from the mortal realm. She drank the elixir, ended up living on the moon. I do think it is a very unique world. The immortal realm has various kingdoms. Another reason I think the world is set up in layers is because the characters actually travel on clouds. So they summon a cloud and it comes and takes them, and then they go from the immortal realm to the mortal, vice versa, wherever they want to go, basically. So back to Xingyin. So she ends up having to flee the moon. Her existence is not known by the immortals and her life is in danger. She ends up fleeing and she ends up living in the celestial kingdom, which is in the immortal realm, and befriends the prince and is kind of like hired as a maid, but a little bit more than just a maid. She like does archery lessons with him. She learns how to fight. While there, she actually learns more about her own magical abilities that she didn't really understand until then. She didn't understand how they worked. And the magic system is a very loose, it's not a very rigid, set rules, things like that. It has more to do with like your own energy and what you can do. And each person just happens to have a different talent. And I think it's really cool. I think it's nice that it's not very structured. So it feels kind of like a Disney movie for adults. So I do want to mention a couple things that detracted from my enjoyment. First off, the world building. Again, it was a little confusing, but I still think it was beautifully described. But second, the characters. So Xingyin and the prince, who she ends up spending a lot of time with, Li Wei, they kind of lack depth as characters. Specifically Xingyin, I think the author could have given her more personality because she kind of felt slightly two-dimensional, not too much, but it was definitely lacking in characterization, and I just wasn't as attached to Xingyin and Li Wei. And another con, in my opinion, is the love triangle in the book. It's in a lot of YA. This is an adult, but it feels very much like it could be either or. But I don't like love triangles. I really don't. And it's not necessarily something that completely detracts from my enjoyment of a book, but love triangles, they're overdone. Going on to the prose, so the mythology, the Chinese folklore, I loved it. I loved the stories. I have so many dog-eared pages at the bottom where it was talking about either something to do with Xingyin's past or the various stories that characters tell each other and the different things that go on in this world and how it's inspired by Chinese folklore. It was so enjoyable in that aspect. For me, another pro, and this might be someone's con, this might be something that makes you not enjoy a book. I've come across it quite often where we have a girl who's like learning a bunch of skills, like archery, combat techniques, and then ends up using them while hiding her true identity. Very Mulan-esque, and I personally love it. It's not for everyone, but it's something that I really enjoy. Another strength, in my opinion, is the writing style. I don't think it was overly flowery, but the author just described such a beautiful world. Like, it was saturated in color and smells and just beautiful. I loved it. Like, this cover just is a portrayal of how I felt while reading this book. Like, it's stunning, especially considering it's a debut. So it's Daughter of the Moon Goddess, and I highly recommend it to fantasy fans. Okay, so my favorite book of the month, I gave 4.5 stars to. The reason I knocked off half a star was because the first half was not as engaging as I was hoping it would be, but after the halfway point, I just adored this book. And that is The Fountains of Silence by Ruta Sepetys. So in this book, we have 3 siblings. We have Rafa, Julia, and Anna. And Anna is the main female protagonist of this book. And so these 3 siblings, they lived through the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, and the book takes place 20 years after, so it is the late 50s. And they're each struggling to make ends meet and, survive. They're living in poverty. Anna ends up working at a very, very affluent hotel where you get a lot of tourists and a lot of very wealthy people visiting. And one of those people happens to be 18-year-old Daniel, who is visiting from America with his parents. And they are very wealthy. They have an oil business going on in America. So they are in Spain on vacation. And Daniel is an aspiring photographer and meets Anna, they develop a friendship. He's taking pictures of the things that are going on. And there are some very, very shady things going on as Spain is under a dictatorship. It's a very scary time to be living in Spain, especially if you were on the wrong side during the Civil War, the losing side, which Anna's family was. They lost their parents. It's, you know, very tragic circumstances. So Daniel, being a photographer, wants to see authenticity. He wants to capture Spain in its authentic form, but doing so is quite dangerous considering there are secret police everywhere. And one aspect of history that this book tackles, and I think it does it very well, is the really, really sad circumstances surrounding babies in Spain at the time. Many women who were Republicans, or the losing side of the war, would give birth to babies, and then they would be told their babies died, but the babies would be stolen and given up for adoption into affluent nationalist Spanish families. And this went on for such a long time. Scholars believe that over 300,000 children were stolen from their real families and given up for adoption. And it's just crazy. Like, I didn't even realize all this was going on after Nazi Germany was gone. Like, there was still such a terrible regime in place in Spain. This book is so heart-wrenching. It is so emotional, and you don't even realize how much you get attached to the characters until certain events happen later in the book. The side characters are amazing. We get a look into the bullfighting that occurs in Spain still to this day, and various other aspects of the fascist regime in the 1950s in Spain, and it's such a good book for historical fiction fans. I highly suggest you try it out, but also go into it knowing it is YA, and so the romance is very YA, and that's another reason I knocked off half a star. But I do think Anna and Daniel are great protagonists, and Daniel has a lot of integrity, so I saw more maturity than I was expecting to see, and I really, really enjoyed this book. Like, when I finished it and I put it down, I kind of was in a book hangover. I was just holding it like, what do I do now? Because it was so good. And the ending was a little different than what I was expecting. It might not be something everyone likes, but I personally really liked how it ended. This is my second Ruta Sepetys book. She is now officially an auto-buy author for me, and I'm so happy I read this book. All right, so those are all the books I read in February. I think it was a decent reading month, and even though I didn't absolutely adore every book I read and DNF'd a few, the books that I did enjoy really leave a lasting impact on me as a reader, and I'm very happy to have read them. If you've read any of the same books, please let me know in the comments. I want to talk to people about the books that we love in common. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm very grateful to each and every one of you for taking time out of your day to watch my ramblings. Thank you very much, and I really hope to see you all in my next video. Bye!